You're in a hole. Not metaphorically. An actual hole, roughly 8 feet deep, cut into the earth beneath what passes for a toilet in 16th century England, and you are standing in it up to your chest. The walls are stone. The smell, I'm going to describe it, and I need you to actually process it, not just skim over the word. Human waste. Weeks of it. Months from an entire household, their servants, their guests, every biological decision they've made since the last time someone like you climbed down here. It is liquid. It is solid. It is some category of matter that sits between both. It is the temperature of a living body. And you are standing in it, in the dark, with a bucket. This was a job. Someone paid a man to do this. Not a criminal. Not a prisoner working off a sentence. A free working man who woke up that evening, because this work happened at night, by law, laced up his boots, picked up his tools, and climbed down into this pit on purpose. He had a name, a family, probably a regular pub where people knew him. And when he descended into that hole, he was doing the work that kept medieval cities from drowning in their own biology. He was called a gong farmer. And by the end of this video, there is a real chance you will have decided that gong farming wasn't even the worst of it. Before we go further, let's agree on something. You already suspect that some of what's coming is going to be spectacularly, historically bad. You're right. But here's what most people miss. The worst jobs in history aren't just disgusting. They're windows into how societies actually functioned, who bore the weight of the things nobody wanted to see, who did the labor that made everything else possible, and what it cost them. The disgust is real. But the story underneath it is the part worth understanding. Let's start with why the gong farmer existed at all. By the 14th century, London had a serious problem. Roughly 80,000 people crammed into a space built for far fewer, and all of them were producing the same daily biological output they always had. The tombs received most of it. Cesspits received the rest, and those cesspits, the standard sanitation technology for centuries, had to be emptied regularly by someone. The rules around this were specific and not negotiable. Gong farmers could only work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. The waste had to be carted outside city limits and buried or sold as fertilizer. Workers were required to live at least 7 yards from any dwelling, not for their own comfort, but because their neighbors demanded it. They were essential. They were also firmly and officially considered to exist outside the social order of the people they served. The work itself had a rhythm. A team of gong farmers, typically 2 to 4 men, would arrive at a property after dark. One descended into the pit, the others hauled filled buckets up by rope, loading them onto a cart. When the cart was full, someone drove it outside the city walls, a journey of several miles sometimes, in complete darkness, unloaded it, and came back for another. A large cesspit could take an entire night to empty. Multiple carts, multiple trips, all before 5 a.m. Then they went home, slept in houses that no respectable neighbor wanted near theirs. Then, did it again the next night. Pay was good. A gong farmer in Tudor England could earn 6 shillings a night, roughly 6 times what an unskilled laborer made in a day. This is the first thing that surprises people. The money was real. It had to be real, because without serious financial incentive, who was going to climb down into that hole? The dangers were not theoretical. Methane and hydrogen sulfide build up in enclosed cesspits. Both are colorless. Both become odorless above a certain concentration, which is the particularly brutal part, because by the time the air stops smelling like anything, you are already in trouble. The gases displaced oxygen fast enough that a man could lose consciousness before anyone above ground realized something had gone wrong. Coroner's records from 1326 document the case of Richard the Raker of Newgate, a gong farmer who fell through a rotten board into his own cesspit and drowned. The record describes it as drowning monstrously in his own excrement. That is the phrase the coroner wrote down. They used the word monstrously, and then moved on to the next case. Here's where this is easy to read as a medieval horror story and keep moving. But stop for a second. These were men who went to work knowing the job could kill them. They went anyway. every night. Because the city needed them. Because there was no one else. Because someone had to do the part of maintaining civilization that civilization preferred not to think about. That is not a punchline. That is something worth sitting with before we move on to find something worse. Let's talk about leech collectors. This one needs a brief note first. For roughly 2,500 years, from ancient Greece through the late 19th century, bloodletting was considered legitimate medicine. The theory was that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's humors, and that removing blood corrected those imbalances. Doctors believed this. Universities taught this. Patients trusted this. And for a significant stretch of European medical history, the primary tool for removing blood was not a lancet. It was a worm. Hirudo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, up to 4 inches long, capable of consuming 10 times its body weight in blood in a single feeding. Equipped with an anticoagulant in its saliva that prevents clotting while it feeds. By the early 19th century, France alone was importing 40 million leeches per year for medical use. Somebody had to get all those leeches. The technique was exactly what you're imagining. Leech collectors, typically women, typically elderly, typically poor, waded into ponds and marshes, bare-legged, and waited. The leeches found them, they attached, they fed. The collector waited until each one had finished and either fell off or was carefully removed. Then she moved to another part of the pond and started again. Payment was by the leech. This meant efficiency mattered. Collectors were wading into increasingly depleted ponds for hours in cold water, often before dawn when leeches were most active. Wounds from leech removal got infected. Collectors developed open sores that attracted more leeches to the same spots. Blood loss from multiple simultaneous feedings, repeated across working weeks, led to chronic anemia in many workers. Women who did this for years described their legs as permanently marked, ulcerated, scarred, slow to heal. One collector testified before a British sanitary commission in the 1840s. She had been collecting leeches since childhood. Her legs had been ulcerated for most of her adult life. During busy seasons, she could spend 8 hours a day in the water. She stated this as a fact, without complaint, in the flat tone of someone describing a commute. That calm is the part that stays with you. And then there were the pure finders. The leather trade in 19th century London required something specific in large quantities to soften hides: dog excrement. Called pure by the trade, a name so obviously ironic it feels like someone's grim joke, it was the chemical agent used in the baiting process that turned raw animal skin into soft, workable leather. Tanneries paid for it by the bucket. Pure finders were the people who collected it. They worked the streets with a wooden pail and a glove, picking up dog dung wherever they could find it, competing with other collectors for the same deposits, selling what they gathered to the tanneries for a few pence per bucket. Henry Mayhew, a journalist who spent years documenting the working poor of Victorian London, interviewed dozens of them in the 1850s. Most were elderly. Many were women. Several reported that it was their only income. One woman told him she sometimes struggled to find enough for a meal, but that she could always find pure when she needed it, and that the tanneries never turned her away. She said this with evident satisfaction. The market was reliable. The tanneries themselves were a separate category of misery, vats of urine, lime, and animal brains for processing hides, a smell that pervaded entire neighborhoods for blocks in every direction, and a rate of lung disease among workers that was documented in coroner's inquiries but never officially explained. The leather that ended up on your shoes, your gloves, the bindings of expensive books. It had traveled a route that most of the people who owned those things would have preferred not to know about. Let's move to ancient Rome, because Rome had a particular talent for taking necessary things and making them spectacularly grim. The Roman cloth industry ran on urine. Fuller's earth and human urine were the primary cleaning agents for wool and linen in Roman laundry, called fulleries, fullonae. The ammonia in aged urine broke down oils and grease in the cloth fibers with a thoroughness that plain water couldn't match. It worked. It also required massive quantities of urine on a continuous basis. which meant that fooleries stationed large clay pots outside their doors on the street, open to the public, specifically for passers-by to urinate into. When the pots filled, workers collected them. The workers themselves, the Folones, spent their days standing in shallow stone vats filled with the mixture, stomping cloth with their feet. Hours of this. The smell of heated stale urine in a Roman summer, in an enclosed stone space, is documented by ancient writers who clearly felt the need to record just how bad it was. Pliny the Elder mentions fooleries in the natural history in a tone that suggests he considered them a special category of public hazard. Pliny was famously willing to sail directly toward an erupting Vesuvius to get a closer look. He found fooleries worth commenting on. The social status of a fuller was approximately at the bottom. Roman satirists used fullers as a shorthand for degraded labor. Catullus uses the word as an insult. And yet fooleries were everywhere. Every Roman city of any size had multiple. The cloth had to be cleaned. The people who cleaned it were so thoroughly invisible to the people who benefited that most of what we know about fooleries comes from archaeology rather than literature. The workers are almost entirely unnamed. Now I want to tell you about a job that involved none of the physical discussed, but was, by another measure, more corrosive than anything we've discussed so far. The executioner. In medieval and early modern Europe, executioners were not simply people who killed other people for payment. They occupied a specific, legally defined social category that varied by region but shared common features across most of the continent. In the German states, the executioner and his family were designated unehrlich, without honor, a legal term that excluded them from guild membership. From marrying into craft families, from being buried in consecrated ground in some jurisdictions, the executioner's wife could be excluded from markets, his children could be barred from skilled apprenticeships. The executioner was necessary. He was also untouchable. Think about what that arrangement actually meant. You are performing a service the law requires, that the state has explicitly authorized, that society has decided must be done. You are not a criminal. You are a civil officer. And the response of the civilization you serve is to formally declare that you, your wife, and your children are outside the bounds of decent company, permanently, by statute, until someone grants you a pardon you have to petition for. The executioners knew exactly what the bargain was. Some tried to manage it through reputation, being known for skill and mercy, for clean work, for making it quick. A botched execution was a professional catastrophe. Crowds sometimes turned on executioners who prolonged a condemned person's suffering, pelting them with refuse. The executioner had to be good at his work, in a context where being good at his work made him more irreversibly untouchable, not less. They often performed not just executions, but a range of tasks the state needed done but didn't want associated with anyone respectable, examining bodies when the cause of death was unclear. Treating patients with certain contagious diseases when no physician would come, removing animal carcasses from public spaces, operating torture equipment during legal interrogations. One executioner in 17th century Nuremberg, Franz Schmidt, kept a detailed diary of his work over 45 years. He recorded 394 executions and 345 lesser punishments, whippings, ear removals, brandings, finger removals. The diary reads like a ledger. No reflection, no flourish. The date, the name, the crime, the method, the outcome. At the end of his career, Schmidt petitioned the city council to restore his family's honor, to remove the unherlich designation from his children who had never held the job themselves. The council agreed. It was considered an act of significant grace. His children were formally declared honorable citizens because they had to be declared it. It was not the default. So where does this leave us? We've had gong farmers asphyxiating in methane, leech collectors developing permanent wounds from decades of waiting, Roman Folones breathing heated urine for 8 hours a day, executioners navigating a life of legal exclusion in exchange for doing exactly what the law required of them. None of these jobs existed in isolation. Every one of them existed because the people above them in the social order had decided that certain functions were necessary but not dignified, that someone had to do them, but that person didn't need to be visible. The invisible labor that kept everything else running. Here is the thing about that arrangement. It required the people at the bottom to keep showing up. And they did. Every day, every night, every winter. The gong farmer who climbed into that Tudor pit was making it possible for the city to function. The leech collector wading into a cold marsh was supplying a medical system that, for all its theoretical wrongness, was the only system available. The fuller in Rome was producing the garments that clothed an empire. The executioner in Nuremberg was administering justice with his own hands so that no one else had to touch it. That is not inspiring in the way we usually use the word. It's something stranger and harder to name. People doing what the group needed done. Not because they were chosen for their virtue. Because someone had to, and the payment was there, and the alternative was worse. Human civilization has always been built partly on that arrangement. The only question is how honest we're willing to be about it. There's a pattern running through all of these jobs that's worth naming before we go further. In almost every case, the workers were not just doing difficult labor. They were doing the labor that made everything else clean. Clean cloth, clean streets, clean leather, clean justice. The product of each of these jobs was a form of cleanliness that the beneficiaries consumed without acknowledgement, and the people who produced it carried the contamination, physical, legal, social, so that everyone above them could pretend it didn't exist. The Roman emperor wore a toga cleaned in a foolery. The wealthy merchant whose wardrobe was made of soft leather had, somewhere upstream in the supply chain, a pure finder with a wooden pail on a London street. The mayor of a medieval city walked clean avenues partly because someone had spent the previous night in a pit beneath a stranger's house. They maintained the civilization. The civilization maintained the fiction that they were barely part of it. There's a third category that ties the physical cost, the mortal risk, and the social erasure together in a way that I think earns the title. And it involves children. The child chimney sweeps of 18th and 19th century Britain. Boys as young as 4, more typically between 6 and 10, were sold by their families or assigned by parish workhouses to master sweeps. The job was to climb chimneys that were sometimes 8 inches wide, pressing elbows and knees against the walls, scraping soot as they went. Masters lit paper or straw beneath them when they stopped moving. Children got stuck. They suffocated inside the flues. They fell. They burned. In 1775, a surgeon named Percival Pott noticed that chimney sweeps developed cancer of the scrotum at dramatically higher rates than any other population. He traced it to soot exposure accumulated over years of work, starting in childhood. It was the first time in medical history that anyone had connected a specific environmental cause to a specific cancer. A genuine milestone in medical understanding. Built on the bodies of small boys who mostly had no say in whether they worked. Parliament debated restricting the use of child sweeps for decades. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 said masters couldn't take apprentices under 8 years old and had to provide clean clothes on Sundays. Largely ignored. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 raised the minimum age to 10. Also largely ignored. It wasn't until 1875 when a 12-year-old named George Brewster became stuck in a flue and suffocated. And a journalist made sure the country knew his name, that Parliament finally passed legislation with actual enforcement mechanisms. One child with a name. That's what it took. The others didn't have that. The others were just the job. What was the worst job in ancient history? There's no clean answer, and the fact that there's no clean answer is probably the point. Every civilization that ever existed found ways to make certain people invisible so that other people could be comfortable. The specific form changed, pits and ponds and flues and stone vats, but the shape of it didn't. Someone had to go where the dirt was. Someone was always told that their discomfort was the price of everyone else's normalcy. And they went. Because the money was real and the alternatives were worse and the group needed it done. We've built infrastructure tall enough that most people today can go an entire life without the walls shaking. That is a genuine achievement. Whether it's an achievement of honesty is a different question. The median person sees a garbage truck pull away and thinks nothing of it. Then the strike happens, and within 2 weeks, the streets make viscerally clear what that labor was always worth. Ancient cities knew. They couldn't hide it from themselves the way we can. The gong farmer's cart went through the streets at night, but everyone heard it. The necessity was visible enough that even when the workers were excluded from society, the exclusion required constant maintenance. You had to keep enforcing the invisibility because the reality kept insisting on being seen. We know the name of Percival Pott, the surgeon who documented the cancer. We know very few names of the boys who gave him the data. Think about who you know history by. And think about who kept things running so that person had a history to make. Drop your answer in the comments, gun to your head, forced choice, which one of these do you take? I genuinely want to know whether you all land where I think you will. And if this got you thinking about just how bad ordinary daily life was, not special jobs, just an average Tuesday for anyone living inside a Roman city, that is exactly where we're going next. Because Rome's daily life extends everything you just heard across an entire city, wall to wall. The urine in the fooleries was only one piece of it. The apartment buildings stacked so high they swayed. The streets that served as sewers between collections. The things Romans did casually, in public, that a modern person would find genuinely difficult to watch. The worst job in Rome was the easy part of the story. The rest of Rome's daily reality is something else entirely, and some of it is going to rearrange a few things you thought you knew.